Thank you. Pleasure to be here today. I'm Michael Becker. My background is a little bit unique in that I spent half of my career in financial services, half of my career as a biotech industry executive, as the chief executive officer of a couple of biotech companies, and then a couple of years ago as a cancer patient. So I was diagnosed in late 2015 with stage 4 head and neck cancer. I went through original or initial treatment, which is chemoradiation. It's a brutal, absolutely awful therapy, but there is a high potential for cure after that. I went through the 8 weeks of daily radiation and chemotherapy, had my first PET scan 6 months later, and it was spot clean. Looked like they got everything. It was good news, and I looked somewhat forward to maybe having conquered that dreaded C word. Unfortunately, 6 months later, which would be my next PET scan, my lungs lit up like a Christmas tree. The disease also spread to my spleen, so dramatic change from just 6 months prior. I tell you that because it's a great illustration of both right to try as well as the channels through the FDA's compassionate use or expanded access programs. I, at that point in time, said I'd had enough. I didn't want to go through chemotherapy again. I didn't want to go through the radiation therapy again. I wanted to try something else. I knew that my time was short, and I wanted to do something aggressive. So I could have approached my physician at that point in time and said, I found this interesting clinical trial online. I think it's right for me. What do you think? And if he agreed, we could have gone the expanded access route. I knew that he would come back to me with the traditional therapy is more chemotherapy. That's the expected second-line treatment. And I didn't want to do that. So I knew that he would not sign off on basically me exhausting all of the other treatment options that were available to me. And that's a real barrier for all programs, whether it's right to try or whether it's the expanded access, because they both have that same element. Your physician has to say, yes, you've exhausted everything else. I think this is not going to do any more harm to you and may be a good treatment option. And I knew my physician wouldn't do that. So I went to the National Institutes of Health, the NIH, not too far from here, and enrolled in a phase 1 clinical trial with Dr. James Goley, who was somebody I knew from my background in the biotechnology industry, and I had no problem getting into the clinical trial. Had I had problems getting into the clinical trial, again, I could have pursued the expanded access route. Now, I went into the trial. It was my decision. I did not seek the advice of my medical oncologist. I knew what I wanted to do, and I knew what I didn't want to do. So I did the clinical study. It was most of the summer during 2017. My disease progressed, and I was taken off study and left with, yet again, another choice. My choice at that point was to listen to my medical oncologist, who probably has a lot more information and a lot more knowledge than I do. Having biotech experience was great and certainly provided me with enough information to make some of my decisions, but I felt that I might have usurped his authority and background by taking that route. And that's essentially what keeps me up at night about making more of these types of programs available to patients, that you're going to have people like me, terminal, that are anxious to try anything and all things that are going to try to cure my disease. And like I did, going for my immunotherapy study at the NIH, I made that decision. I had no side effects almost whatsoever. It was great. But it ultimately didn't make a change in my disease. I'm back on chemotherapy. I'm actually leaving here to go to New York to get my next dose and start my next cycle of therapy. It'll be cycle number 9. My disease has shrunk 20 to 30 to 40% every time they've done a CT scan after the chemotherapy regimen that I'm on. I could argue that that's somewhat because of the treatment that I received at the NIH, but it would never be able to be proven. So I have to say that the traditional painful chemotherapy route that my physician recommended ultimately was the right thing for me, and it's been keeping my disease at bay now for the better part of 6 or 7 months, and hopefully will continue. But I think that putting patients in the position of being able to make that choice. That avenue exists to them today. It is the FDA route. I think that other routes that take them out of the equation for the added safety and for the added input that they have could be dangerous, especially when it comes to the marketing of these drugs. I can envision a time where somebody has a good experience in a phase 1 trial, says, wow, I happen to be treated just fine. I looked at the phase 1 study that I joined. There were some complete responders that had similar disease to mine. So I looked at that and said, well, that's evidence that, you know, this drug works, and I'm going to hope to heck that it works for me. And ultimately it didn't. I'm afraid that additional phase 1 data out in the public and patients making decisions on the basis of what they see in that study or what the physicians see in that study could be detrimental. So I'll stop there and leave the microphone for my next colleague, Laura.